Good evening, and welcome to the Anti-Racism Project Speaker Series. My name is Colin, and I'm a parishioner at St. Charles Borromeo Resurrection in All Saints Church in Harlem. Tonight is the first of a series of talks that will aim to educate, challenge, share, and galvanize and inspire action amongst Catholics to take a more active role in the fight against the sin of racism. Uh, to explain what we're doing here tonight, I have to take you back a couple of years ago. In 2019, St. Charles spoke to St. Francis de Sales and St. Francis Xavier and asked if we'd be interested in coming together, sitting down, and talking about race. And that was it. We got together in the basement of St. Charles, ate some Subway sandwiches, shared Dunkin' coffee, and we spoke with each other. Father Brian Massingale moderated the discussion. He's a professor and academic at Fordham University. But what we realized in that talk was that we needed to pledge to continue having the conversation. There was too much information and personal experiences to be shared for us not to continue to speak. I'll fast forward now to last summer and the events that, for all intents and purposes, shook us. It was not the first nor the last of this type of brutality, but those instances of, let's call it what it was, public executions, made undoubtedly clear that declarations against racism were not enough. Right? We needed to be more active. So St. Charles Borromeo Resurrection, St. Francis Xavier, St. Francis de Sales sat down again in the midst of a global pandemic, virtually, of course, and asked whether we can use our Catholic faith to provide for some racial reconciliation. We applied for a grant with Catholic Charities, and it helped to launch the programs that we're happy to share with you today. The speaker series is part of our journey in answering the question of whether we can use our race to provide, our faith to provide for racial reconciliation. So the Anti-Racism Project welcomes you and thanks you for making the decision to join us in our anti-racist approach to help undo vestiges of racism and to engage in some racial healing. That said, it's intentional that we chose the topic that we chose today to start, the history of race within the Catholic Church. You know, the project reflected on this, and as shown in through the examine, we thought that these conversations should start off with an awareness of a reality, so that we can reckon with that reality. And we've designed it this way because we believe that's impossible to arrive at a point of healing if we don't know, or we don't have a comprehensive understanding of what we seek to heal from. So this is the first of a series of talks, and we'll put them on the first Tuesday of every month. And it'll be right here, this link, this forum. And let me give you just a little bit of what tonight will look like. Tonight we will hear from a speaker, and again, she will talk about the history of race in the Catholic Church within the United States. And then we'll have a portion towards the end for question and answer. There's a function in your YouTube chat, in your YouTube on page to comment. I see it, and I'll just ask the questions, and Boreta will answer for you. But we have the pleasure of hearing tonight from Boreta Singleton. Boreta is a member of this project and also a member of St. Francis Xavier in Manhattan. She's an educator of theology and is currently a director of faculty formation at St. Peter's Prep High School in Jersey City. And at the Francis Xavier, she serves in the ministries of racial justice, music, liturgy, and spiritual direction. So, with that, I'd like to introduce Boreta Singleton to speak with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Colin. Welcome to everyone this evening. Um, I give a full disclaimer by saying that this is an extremely brief history of racism in the Catholic Church in the United States. Very brief. And I would encourage you to continue to do your own research. I'm going to just highlight some of the areas where I felt were most important for us to consider. And I know there are many, many others. So let us begin. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. Okay, this is very brief history. So I'd just like to start with a definition of what do we mean by racism? What do I mean by racism? Well, racism has lots of definitions, but I'm operating out of these two. We usually think of racism as being a personal prejudice, but tonight we're really focusing on the structures or the systems that support the unequal treatment of people. And so, as we know, the church is an institution, and in the institution, we have lots of structures and systems. So, I'd like to start with these papal decrees that are sometimes called papal bulls. And the reason they're called that is it's just simply a charter issued by a pope, a decree, and it comes from the word bull, comes from the stamp that would have been used to put onto the document to make sure that it was authentically coming from the pope. So the first one we're going to talk about is called Inter Caetera, Pope Alexander VI, 1493. So we all know that little rhyme. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So the Pope was in support of the Spanish and Portuguese who were conquering these new lands. And so this papal decree talks about the fact that any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered or claimed, and that the Catholic faith, Christian religion, be exalted and spread, that the health of souls be cared for, and that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. So now we know those barbarous nations are the native peoples who are indigenous to these lands. So on this map, you see that in red, we have the Spanish uh, territories, Mexico, going into Central America, going into South America, Florida, and the islands, and then the Portuguese, what we would consider to be the area of Brazil and some areas in Africa. So we call these papal bulls the doctrine of discovery. We're going to talk about a few more of them. And so these papal bulls become the basis for Europe to make these claims in the Americas. Remember, this is all being done in the name of religion. And of course, we know that in Europe, Spain, France, were all Catholic countries, right? The British were mostly Protestant with some Catholics. And also, we have, the sense of up against this. Remember, we have the Puritans and the Pilgrims who are claiming religious freedom, yet their brothers and sisters in the South have slaves. So we have this dichotomy happening here that's not so great. So these papal bulls were used against the indigenous people here in the United States. And unfortunately, in this case, in 1823, the Supreme Court ruled for the United States. And the bottom line here is that, sorry to read to you a little bit, but I think this bears a little bit of explanation. In 1775, Thomas Johnson and some British citizens purchased land in Virginia from members of the Piankashaw Indian tribe under a 1763 proclamation from the King of England. Thomas Johnson died and left the land to his heirs. In 1818, William McIntosh purchased from Congress 11,000 acres of the land originally purchased by Johnson. Johnson's heirs sued McIntosh in the United States court to recover the land. But the thing is that the Plankashaw tribe didn't have any right to get involved in this because the United States had already taken that land from them, you know, by this principle of discovery. So, in essence, the American Indians only had the right of occupancy of the land. And if the United States wanted that land, they could just push them off. So we go a little deeper here. Even before Columbus, we have this papal bull that supported slavery. This is Pope Nicholas V, and this is uh, from Portugal, connecting to the Portuguese crown. That they can certainly capture or conquer any place where there are not Christians, put them into perpetual slavery, take away all their possessions and property. This is all being done in the name of religion. Again, in 1455, Pope Nicholas says that, he's justifying the expansion of African slavery within the Portuguese colonies because now Portugal has gotten involved in Africa and is beginning to bring slaves over to what would be now the West Indies. And they want to make these claims for themselves, right? But then there's this little disclaimer here that says that if people want to negotiate with the Portuguese, if they convert to Christianity, then maybe some provisions can be made for them if they convert. So now we have the opposite. Okay, so now we have in 1537 this decree from Pope Paul III about the fact that um, those who are exploring the Americas should not be treating anyone less than because they want to conquer the land, right? He says here, even though these people are outside the faith, they should not be deprived of their liberty. Rather, they are to be able to use and enjoy this liberty and this ownership of property freely and licitly, and they are not to be reduced to slavery. So now we have a pope speaking out about what's happening with slavery. So, when did Africans arrive in the United States? Well, we usually use the date of 1619. Here's a little homework for you if you have not had the opportunity to read the articles from the 1619 Project of the New York Times. I would really encourage you to do so. But we know that enslaved Africans were brought to Spain, to St. Augustine, Florida, pardon me, brought by Spain to St. Augustine, Florida, as early as 1565. So we see here that in 1602, there were 56 slaves in St. Augustine. And in 1692, King Charles II of Spain uh, said that any slave could be free if you wanted to join the Spanish militia to help to conquer more land for the Spanish, or if you decided to convert to Catholicism, one or the other, you could get your freedom. So St. Augustine basically became a haven for a period of time for enslaved blacks from Georgia and South Carolina. That, though, was short lived. So, I'd like to give a little bit of an antidote to all of this violence and sadness. Uh, this is a Dominican priest, Bartolome de las Casas, who worked in Hispaniola. Hispaniola would be the island that contains the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And he was sent there to work, and he saw how the native peoples of the West Indies were being treated. And in 1545, as a bishop back in Spain, he ordered that the slaves be freed. And he says here, what we committed in the Indies stands out among the most unpardonable offenses ever committed against God and mankind in this trade. He's talking about trading the native peoples of the West Indies as one of the most unjust, cruel, and evil practice. So we have an advocate here in him. But then, there are lots of questions about Junipero Serra and how Spain acted in the time of the establishment of the California missions. So Junipero Serra was declared a saint when Pope Francis was here in 2015. And he was a Spanish Franciscan. He volunteered for the missions to come from Spain to California. This is after the Jesuits were suppressed. The Jesuits were in the lower California, and the Franciscans took their places there after the Jesuits were suppressed. So he was in Mexico City in 1750, and then he moved to Baja California in 1767, where the Jesuits were. And then the Spanish expanded their territory from just Baja California up into what we now know as the state of California. So the missionaries kind of lived in two worlds here, because they were not only supposed to be doing church work, but they were also employees of the Spanish government, of the Spanish crown, of the king. So the Spanish goal was to civilize the Native Americans. And by that, it meant that they wanted them to become European. They wanted them to take on the characteristics of being a person from Europe. So, how would you do that? Well, they decided that living in a Christian community would help to achieve their purpose, right? To make the native people docile, as though they needed to be made docile. So, you know, there was some force, but more it was a matter of choice for Native Americans. And, they encouraged them to go to the missions. Um, Apparently, Junipero Serra was an excellent preacher and had a good relationship with the native peoples, and so did many of the Franciscans. And so some of the native people might have been interested in becoming Catholic, but some of them were really in need of their basic necessities. The Spanish really pillaged their farms and their ranches. And so, it became a very difficult time for them, because they were losing their land, they were losing their cattle, they were losing their crops. And so they really were hungry. Some of them were hungry and without the basic needs. They couldn't feed their children. So they really sought refuge at the missions. But, the reality here was that what was unclear for the Native Americans was this was not a visit. Entering the mission was really like a one-way street. Once you went in, you didn't leave. And if you tried to escape, you would be beaten and captured and brought back. So, in effect, the native peoples were acting as workers for the mission, farming, taking care of the church, doing all kinds of work. This is a picture of the very first mission in San Diego, California. So, how did Junipero Serra see his role? I read a couple of articles about this, and one of them was by a gentleman who wrote a book. He and his wife wrote a book about Junipero Serra. So, at this time, we understand from Junipero Serra's writings that he did believe in the Spanish Empire. He did believe in what the Spanish were doing regarding trying to make the native peoples, as they would have considered it, civil, you know. But he also felt that he needed to protect the Native Americans from destruction. So, the thing is that the Spanish were just running over, excuse me, the Spanish were just running over the land of the native people, taking what they wanted. And they didn't enslave them, but they were like indentured servants to them without the pay. They were not getting paid, but they were like indentured servants. So many Native American people did appreciate Junipero Serra. He was very kind to them. He tried to be um, kind to the people who were being abusive of the Native Americans. He didn't like dealing with the Spanish military, and he didn't like trying to get them to not be abusive to the Native Americans. Um, but, he did not fully appreciate the culture and practices of the Native Americans. And he had this, as most of the people who were running the missions had, a very paternalistic attitude toward the Native Americans. This whole sense of the barbarity of indigenous people comes from these papal bulls when, Spain and Portugal and then France and these other countries were like running over, literally, the lands of the indigenous people, and they just treated them like they were not intelligent, that they had no culture, that they had no religion. They just treated them very poorly. And so this kind of paternalistic attitude really caused, and when the statues were toppling last year after George Floyd's death and after the um, Confederate flags started to come down, that many statues of Junipero Serra were toppled in California because people were angry about this whole um, practice of being so abusive to the Native Americans and really kind of erasing their culture. So now we have some papal decrees that really condemn slavery because things are getting out of control now. And probably the most important one was from Pope Gregory the 16th in 1839. And, he really is very pointed in what he says about slavery. And, here he says, um, we reprove by virtue of our apostolic authority all the practices, and he has like a whole list of all these things that, you know, abusive practices that slaveholders are having, um, all the practices as absolutely unworthy of the Christian name. By the same authority, we prohibit and strictly forbid any ecclesiastic, that would be a bishop or a priest, or lay person from presuming to defend as permissible this traffic in blacks under no matter what pretense or excuse, or from publishing or teaching in any manner whatsoever, in public or privately, opinions contrary to what we have set forth in this letter. So Pope Gregory is saying, like, don't use a lame excuse for having a slave. That you can't justify that with the Bible. You can't justify that with the gospel. you need to treat people equally because that's what God wants you to do. However, that was not always heeded. So here we have John Carroll, our first American bishop, who said he had no slaves, yet his sister sent him one of her slaves to work in his home. Um, Many bishops had slaves, and you know, many Catholic slaves were deterred from practicing their religion by their masters. Um, Christianity can be traced back to really the Acts of the Apostles, when the Apostle Philip baptized the Ethiopian court official in the Acts of the Apostles. And many historians, many church historians consider that the beginning of Christianity in Africa. So it wasn't like many slaves came here. Some slaves did come here practicing Christianity. uh, some Southern bishops felt obligated to defend slavery. They felt that because they had slaves, so it was okay. And, they didn't want to trouble the consciences of the slaveholders because the slaveholders had money and the slaveholders were helping to pay their salaries and pay for the churches to be built and for schools to be built. So the bishops did not want to trouble the consciences of the slaveholders, so they didn't really preach strongly against, um, many of them did not, most of them did not preach strongly against slavery. This is just a list of the religious communities in the United States that had slaves. Um, Certainly, um, these communities have now tried to, they have admitted that they had slaves and have tried to make some reparations. I'm most familiar with the Jesuits at Georgetown, that they have set up a center for reparations and are encouraging education for the descendants of the slaves that they held. I know that the Religious of the Sacred Heart are doing the same. Even in some communities like the Ursulines, if a young woman entered their community, she may have brought a slave or two with her as part of her dowry, unfortunately. I'd like to mention a few people here who I think are important to the story. Father Augustus Tolton, who was the first Black priest in the United States, who was born into slavery and wanted to be a priest, but no seminary would admit him. So, through the intervention of the Franciscans, he went to Rome to study. He was ordained in 1886, and I found out doing a little research that his first Mass in the United States was in Hoboken, New Jersey. Um, he also had his first solemn Mass at St. Benedict the Moor in New York City, parish that is no longer open. But Father Augustus Tolton really suffered. He thought that he would go to Africa as a missionary because the people, the white bishops in the United States, treated him so poorly. And eventually he was able to go to Chicago and help to minister to the African American Catholics there. Um, really, a man who, as I'm sure you know, is up for sainthood, and suffered really unbelievably at the hands of the unfortunate clergy in his hometown of Quincy, Illinois, and also here in the United States. These communities of religious women of color that were established to help to educate and care for uh, children of color here in the United States when white communities would not accept uh, uh, postulants into their communities of color. The first, the Oblate Sisters of Providence, um, the Sisters of the Holy Family in New Orleans, and the Franciscan Handmaids of the Most Pure Heart of Mary in Georgia, and um, also long history in Harlem at many schools there. How did lay people get involved in trying to help to eradicate this racism? Well, here in New York in 1853, um, before this time, African American children were welcome to attend St. Vincent de Paul School, which was then down on Canal Street in Manhattan. But as time progressed, the white parents were not comfortable with their children going to school with black children. Apparently, this pastor, Father Lafont, was very much um, in support of the parish and the school being integrated. But when the whites threatened to withdraw their children, he offered to teach them. And so the school continued in the basement of the church for a while. And Pierre Toussaint, who's also up for sainthood, also offered to, he helped to fund that school. But somehow the school was closed because of this dissent among the white parishioners. And 26 black laity wrote to Pope Pius the ninth, asking for a Catholic school. Um, you probably know the name John Hughes, Bishop John Hughes, who founded Fordham University and built St. Patrick's Cathedral, um, was not at all in support of people of color. And so he, the this delegation of African American Catholics went to see the vicar of the diocese, and talked to him and asked, we would like to have a school, we would like to have our children educated in a Catholic environment, and there was no connection there, no desire to make this happen. So the papal nuncio made sure that the Pope saw the letter, and he responds to Bishop Hughes, but apparently there was not a response recorded from Bishop Hughes. This is something else I'd like to highlight, and I'm going to be quiet in about 3 minutes. Native American boarding schools. Again, this is the same um, concern that happened from these papal bulls, that the Native Americans were not treated as equals, not treated as human beings, treated in a way that they were not important, that their culture was not important. So many of these schools that were staffed by the Catholic Church really denied children the opportunity to learn their native language or their cultures or their customs. They were not permitted to speak their native language in school. They would, be subjected to being beat, or had food withheld from them. They even said that in some schools they found uh, children buried on the property, and the parents were never told, or never told the truth. These children, some of them starved to death because they would not conform. Um, Very sad chapter in our history, and many painful stories of these practices in the name of religion. So I'm going to stop talking now, because I'm not going to talk forever here. But you know, um, these are some things that we don't have time to cover tonight. We could have another 3 hours, but these are some issues that I just like to place in your mind. Um, you know, of recent days, there've been lots about how we connect in our schools. And so, what is the treatment of students of color attending mostly all white Catholic schools? Um, I was saying to some of my students that this is, they were having a conversation about, some of our students of color were having a conversation about their time in our school. These are seniors. And I'm hearing the same things I experienced in school, 40 years ago. Something's wrong. The closure of inner city parishes and schools, you know, many parents depend on Catholic schools to give their children an education. And when the public schools are not sufficient for them, we have stepped in, our church has stepped in many times to help to provide that education. How are clergy and religious of color treated? You know, the church has not really, the majority of our bishops and cardinals have not supported Black Lives Matter. You know, we have not seen the kind of support that we need. This is a gospel issue, it's a life issue. Our BIPOC people are being killed in the streets. We don't see, for the most part, bishops out there protesting. And a respect for and celebration of new immigrants. We used to have national parishes, and those parishes existed in some way. It was a bit of racism, but in another way, it was to help people to assimilate to the country, to learn English, if they needed to be able to get a job, to be able to connect with people who spoke their language, to be able to have their foods, to be able to celebrate Mass. Um, how are we treating our new immigrants? How's our church treating our new immigrants? In some cases, fine. In other cases, really not. So I'm going to stop talking, and I think we have some time for some questions or comments, which you are welcome to write in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Burita. Um, all right. Um, I just, you know, I was really struck by a few things. The narrative. I kind of heard two narratives growing up about what the history of the Catholic Church is with race. It's one, an extremely negative view of that narrative, and the other is I guess, a positive view with respect to race and so it was interesting to see and understand the dissonance between the papal office, right, the central Catholic institution, and what bishops and cardinals and priests were doing.
Mhm.
That really did strike me. But we are going to get into some questions now. Um, you know what? Let me start off with my question because I was interested in your last slide and the issues yet to be explored, all of which are extremely important issues. And you're right. And I have not heard, and we haven't seen a backing from the Catholic Church with some of these issues. I wonder what you thought were the most pressing or is the most pressing concern from that
Mhm.
last slide that the church should get behind.
Yeah, I really think as far as I'm concerned, I really think the lack of our church leaders supporting Black Lives Matter. And, the reason I say that is because Black Lives Matter is a life issue. It's a life issue, just like abortion is a life issue, just like euthanasia is a life issue, just like how we treat our immigrants. If we're putting children in cages, that's a life issue. And so getting a vaccine is a life issue. This is a life issue. And I understand when the bishops say that abortion is a preeminent issue. I understand that. But I also understand the fact that we have uh, young men and young women of color being shot to death in our streets for no reason. And I can't understand how the church doesn't see that as a life issue. And I know that there are some bishops and there are some priests and there are some, clergy members who are speaking out, but they are few and far between. And, for some who do speak out, they get highly criticized. And so I find that really disheartening.
Right. Highly criticized and even stripped of their roles. Right.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
Let me go to our chat section because we do have a few questions here. This one comes from uh, Tanya Douglas from St. Charles Borromeo. Should Catholic schools revise its curriculum to center the contributions of Blacks outside of just 28 days in February? Also, the contributions of Black, Indigenous, and people of color?
Amen. Amen. For sure. And I really do think that even in our Catholic schools, our students don't know about the people of color who are being the six African Americans who are being nominated to be saints. They have no idea who they are. And so, this is really a need in our church. I always say, I look forward to the day when we don't need to have Black History Month or Asian American Month or Women's History Month, because that's going to be part of the curriculum. And so I say amen to the curriculum.
That's right. It always strikes me that some folks are up for sainthood, haven't been canonized yet. So that always strikes me. Here's a question from Matthew Ryan Bender. He says, "What was the church's presence or absence during the civil rights movement?"
Mhm. Hi, Matthew Ryan Bender. Um, so, you know, the turning point was Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail and also what happened in Selma, because, TV was doing live presentations then, and people witnessed the horror of what happened on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And so Dr. King really appealed to the white clergy of the North to get involved. And I would say that for the most part, there were some bishops who got involved. I would say many more religious communities of women and men got involved. But there were some bishops who did get involved in the civil rights movement and were criticized for it, by some, but not to the extent I think that today. I feel that the bishops are much more polarized. Like everything in our country is polarized, our who's getting a vaccine, who's not going to get the vaccine, who's going to wear a mask, who's not wearing a mask. So the same thing is true of who's supporting civil rights and who isn't. And I feel as though in the 60s and the 50s, that many more bishops were interested in desegregating their schools. The bishop of, I believe it was St. Louis, right away desegregated his schools in a different way than the civil authorities did. So many more. The Jesuits were out there, trying to be present to people, and um, I think that the church was more visible in the civil during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s than they are today out on the front lines. Sister Thea Bowman says in her talk, where they put the bishops and the clergy right in the front line of those marches. And when you see Dr. King with the people marching, you often see sisters and priests and bishops out there too.
Thank you. We have another question from Cynthia from St. Francis de Sales. She asks, how can lay people support the church leaders who are vocal about Black Lives Matter? And I might just add another portion there. I wonder the inverse, right? What can leaders who are vocal about Black Lives Matter in the Catholic Church do for those lay people who want to
Mhm.
also engage in that movement?
Well, for one of my Lenten practices this year, I decided to choose 40 clergy, bishops to write to, and all 40 are people that I don't see supporting Black Lives Matter or supporting BIPOC people. Um, that's how I act. I write. I was involved with my parish, a group of friends that I sing with in our church choir. We wrote a letter to Cardinal Dolan because when George Floyd died, he buried the literally the mention of George Floyd in like paragraph 12 of a letter to the archdiocese. And, George Floyd's death had happened like the week before. So I feel as though picking up my pen and writing is more important than anything that I personally can do. I feel as though even if they don't read it, at least I know I mailed it and it got to them hopefully, and hopefully they're going to read it. On the flip side, I also do write when they do something good. Bishop Mark Seitz down in El Paso was the one who knelt with the Black Lives Matter sign, and Pope Francis called him to thank him for doing that, basically. And so I wrote him a letter to say thank you. And so I tried to praise and also to prod in a sense. I'm also sending them a copy of Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail.
That's right. Thank you for that. I let me go to so Maura Egan has a question, um, and she says, "Do you know the extent to which Catholic schools teach about the role of the Catholic Church in slavery and in the slave trade?"
Um, I know that it's usually not in the curriculum. I know in our school we teach it. I don't. I think because kids are so tight with time and curriculum that is not always taught. I know that we make it a point to teach it, and hopefully there are other schools, but usually now because of the regents exams and those things that kids have to the teachers have to stick to the curriculum of the state, and often states don't teach that. So, as a Catholic school, we choose to teach it.
Very good. I want to just take this moment and note that what helped us really form and launch this program is a grant from Catholic Charities and really some guidance and help from Richard Espinal from Catholic Charities. And he has a question.
Ah,
Yeah, so considering the role of the U.S. Church in upholding slavery, Jim Crow, and systemic racism, and the abandonment of very souls of BIPOC, is there a need to have a conversation about reparations?
I think there is a need to have a conversation about reparations because even right now in the Congress, they're having this argument about um, giving parents money. And just before we came on tonight, I was listening to the PBS NewsHour, and they had a profile of three mothers, a single father, and two single mothers. And the one single mother said, um, that she would really appreciate that money because she's working an entry level job, and she said I can't she said I can just barely put food on the table. She had two jobs. She lost one job. Another father, I felt so sad, it broke my heart because he said, my daughter doesn't ever ask me for anything. She's little, she's like maybe 6 or 7. And he said we were in the dollar store and she asked me for a ball, and he said I just couldn't afford it. He said I just couldn't give it to her. And he started to cry. And I thought, yes, we do need to talk about reparations because I think it's only fair. Much has been taken away from our people. And I think that it's only fair to think about how can we help to level the playing field for everyone.
So I'm just going to follow up with this one question that Deborah asks from St. Charles Borromeo Resurrection and All Saints. She asked, well, you know, who takes on the lead of having the conversation about reparations in the Catholic Church. How do we
Mhm.
actually do that?
Yeah, I would like to see one. I would like to see the president of the Bishops' Conference, Archbishop Gomez. I would like to see him gather the cardinals of the United States to begin to have that conversation. You know, I think that would be important. I think it would be important to involve the bishops of color here in the United States as well about uh, that conversation. And maybe that's a letter that needs to be written.
And it looks like this is a natural point for us to end our conversation, as I don't see any more questions for us. I would just note that a commenter has told us to check out the film Sisters of Selma, that talks
Yes.
about the
Hmm.
Catholics in the civil rights movement.
Yes.
So do check out that film. I
Yes.
want to thank you, Boreta, for sharing with us all that information, all that rich information to help us get a better sense, a more comprehensive sense of what our history is and where we need to go and move forward. I want to thank everybody who was watching tonight, and everybody who will watch later on. This will be here live on YouTube. This page for your viewing later on. So that's that. But thank you all. Thank you, Burita. And we'll be
Thank
back
you.
here next month. I believe the date is April 6th, and we'll be talking about structural racism, implicit bias, and what is white privilege. If you refer to your flyers, the flyers do have the dates and the topics of every other speaker series that we'll put on, and we'll be right here every first Tuesday of the month. So thank you so much. Thank you, Burita, and we'll
Thank
see
you.
you.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.